From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Okay, hi everybody. It's June 25th, 2013. We are the An-sky Yiddish Heritage Ensemble. We're all from New York City. And we're performing here as part of the American Folklife Center's Homegrown Concert Series. And as part of the concert series, we also do an oral history interview. And that's what we're here to do today. I'm pleased to be joined with, from the far left, Ethel Raim. That's geographically, not politically necessarily, but possibly.
Maybe that also.
But Ethel is back in New York. We work together in an organization called Center for Traditional Music and Dance, which has been around for 45 years. Ethel is a co-founder of that organization and our artistic director. We have one of the true Klezmer pioneers, pioneer of the revitalization of Yiddish culture and Klezmer music over the last 35, 40 years. Michael Alpert, who's been a big inspiration to me and many of us who have followed in his footsteps in this renaissance of Yiddish culture internationally. And to my immediate left is a wonderful violinist, though still quite young in his career, not even 30 years old. He's already internationally recognized as one of the tops in the field, Jake Shulman-Ment. And so we're glad to have him. I'm Pete Rushefsky, so I work with Ethel at Center for Traditional Music and Dance, and as part of this An-sky Yiddish Heritage Ensemble. Just to say, at the An-sky Ensemble, we're sort of brought together inspired by the 100th anniversary of the An-sky expedition, which Mike will talk more about. But we try and take inspiration from that important folklore collecting journey in terms of, I guess, uncovering repertoire, preserving repertoire from the past, also, performing music that, we grew up with in one way or another, and as well as Klezmer and Yiddish music as a creative medium where we're creating new repertoire, new music, new sounds, much of it in a sort of way that's both traditionally rooted but also very contemporary. Jake particularly has been doing a lot of composing, as is Michael, over the years. So with that, I'll hand it over first to Michael. Maybe Michael, you can say a little bit, maybe first about the An-sky expedition, and then if you want to say a little bit about this wider sort of, you like to use the word revitalization rather than some people say revival of Klezmer music, but you're a big proponent that it's a revitalization, so I'll hand it over to you.
I'll use them all, but yeah. A word about An-sky, as he's known in really properly, because An-sky was a pseudonym. But to talk about the Jewish ethnographic expeditions, these were ethnographic expeditions organized in the late Russian Empire from 1911, 12, 13 up to 1914 to the outbreak of World War I. And particularly organized by S. An-sky, who's sometimes known as, in Yiddish he's called Shin An-sky, from the Jewish letter Shin. It was a pseudonym that he took. His name was Shlomo Rappaport, and he was born in near Vitebsk in White Russia, Belarus. And he was really we could call him the father of East European Jewish ethnography. He was a poet, a playwright. He's probably best known for being the author of the Dybbuk, the great Yiddish play, and which was made into a major motion picture in 1939. And under his leadership, Jewish ethnographic expeditions were organized in he raised money for the expeditions to go and collect what there was to be collected of folklore, folk life, meaning both performance traditions and material culture in particularly in Ukraine in those years just leading up to the First World War. And so a great deal of what we know about the Yiddish world of pre-World War I Eastern Europe and the first efforts to document things in a modern ethnographic sense were realized during these expeditions. And there was lots and lots of recordings of song, instrumental music, and song being secular and religious traditions were, as well as, a whole host of, everything pretty much that could be collected and in regard to the East European Jewish world and its artifacts and its performative artifacts, so to speak, were gathered there and became part of the Jewish museum that was opened in Russia in St. Petersburg, like a national Jewish museum for the Russian Empire, opened in 1914. An-sky was also a tireless fighter for social justice, and that was all of this went very much together. I would say, like a number of the great American figures that have been active in folklore collecting and documentation, and the idea was also of An-sky's work and his colleagues was to not only just to gather this material and put it in a museum, but for it to provide the inspiration for a new Jewish new Jewish art forms, both in music, in painting and other artwork. People like Marc Chagall, Elie Sitsky, and others came very much out of this kind of consciousness of East European traditional culture and roots as the basis for a new modernist East European Jewish art. And so we're not the only ones. There are a number of people, especially of late, who are focused on doing much the same kind of things in contemporary contexts as An-sky was, and An-sky and colleagues. And so I guess all of us in various ways are involved in both delving into traditional roots and as well as living and performing that material, and in a sense that kind of lifestyle in many ways, and bringing that out in our art and performance and in our work, both, I would say, both as performers and as folklorists, ethnomusicologists, what's the word, Vermittler in Yiddish, people who help transmitters of Yiddish tradition.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, Ethel, you grew up in the Bronx, and Yiddish was very much a part of your life right from the get-go. Could you talk a little bit about your experience? And you grew up in, I guess, what is known now as or even then as a Linka community.
Yeah, it was near the co-ops, which was an interesting experiment in living. It was owned by people who lived in the apartments and run very communally. And I grew up in a Yiddish-speaking household. Parents came from two different places. My stepmother came from Odessa, and my dad came from Lomza. And
that's Poland, right?
Poland.
Mm-hmm.
And I grew up going to a progressive secular shul, learning to read and write Yiddish and reading the wonderful authors. I wasn't a very good student, but there I was, and that was my world, and out of which my worldview really came. I also went to Camp Kinderman, which again was a secular progressive Jewish camp, and the singing was both in American folk music and Yiddish folk music. It was more of the choral singing actually, and I didn't take that much to that aspect. I always really liked the intimate repertoire of people singing solo and sort of singing for themselves but sharing the music, and the music sort of being a way of sustaining themselves and also as a result sustaining a community. And that was always my orientation. And I took a big foray into Balkan music. And I think, it's interesting when I think about, what attracted me to which repertoire and why. It's really in the last, I guess the last 30 years that I've been more involved in Yiddish singing. We very fortunate to have had the opportunity to do a wonderful tour with Dave Terrace. And I thought of Dave when you were talking about something else this afternoon, and I can't remember what the association was. Oh, yeah. Dave, in his interview.
There's just say Dave Terrace was
Yes.
probably the leading American klezmer musician. He was really the guy who, I think more than anybody, a clarinetist, virtuoso, born in Ukraine, who really led the development of a distinctively American klezmer repertoire and sound. He really changed the music in many fundamental ways. And at the end, you worked with him to kind of help spark a new revival of interest in the music.
Right.
But back up to what you were going to say now.
But the piece of the story, which I think is really so many immigrants have that experience, especially if they're musicians. They come to America and they somehow imagine that they're going to have to leave all that cultural stuff behind, including Dave. And when he came, he wasn't playing very much. And his relative got him a job as a furrier. And there's this one beautiful section in the interview with him, and he says, and I took out my furrier's knife and I gave it back because he had been discovered. Someone realized not only, what a giant musician, he also could do studio gigs because he could read music and he composed music. And he was the whole package. But that experience, with Elias, another fantastic Greek musician, lyra player, they come here and imagine that they just have to leave all of that behind. And I'm sorry, I'm talking a little bit about the center and people that do work like the center does, where it's really to make sure that people have the opportunity to express themselves culturally. And it goes back to Lomax. And, the idea of cultural equity, and that is, the right of every community to express its culture. But I'll back up. So I went into this foray of Balkan music, and the Yiddish was parallel to it. But having the opportunity to work with Dave and doing the tour, we did a Jewish music tour with Dave.
And that was 1978?
78, and the tour was 1980, 1981. And the audiences, there were always people who, for whom Dave had played their wedding, or they were the children of the people that he played the wedding. And it also gave me the opportunity to work with several singers, including Bela at that time, Bela Gottesman, Bela Schechter Gottesman, who is the daughter of Lifsche Widman, Schechter Widman, who's just an incredible repository of repertoire. And when I grew up, there was like a standard repertoire. And you would hear the songs over and over and over. They were beautiful, and everyone knew them. And it's important because that's when you can get together with a group of people and you have a shared repertoire. And so you can sing together. Starting with Bela and with Fagel Juden, who also performed at the Dave Taras concerts and was an informant for Ruth Rubin, and is credited in the material that Ruth collected, sung by Fagel Juden from Grodny Gubernia. And she would often talk about how Ruth wanted to be able to sing like she did because she was a folk singer. I mean, the dynamics were really interesting. And Ruth, of course, is Ruth Rubin, who did phenomenal work in collecting and recording Yiddish songs that we just owe her such a debt of gratitude for the music that she has made available. And her archives, the material that she recorded is now at YIVO and in Haifa and
here.
And here.
At the Library of Congress. Yeah.
At the library, that's right. So it was really, over the last 30 years, 25 years, that my involvement increased and became different, and I began to think about the songs and the music differently and participate in a more active way.
Ethel, let me just follow up with that by asking, I mean, in Europe, I mean, my understanding, a lot of, first of all, there's different strands of repertoire. Maybe Michael can talk about that in a minute, different strands of Yiddish song repertoire. But there was so much of it was really a women's art in Europe, which carried over. Also, a lot of it was, I mean, women would as they were working the fields, they would be singing and things like that.
Are you talking about Balkan?
No.
What fields?
Well, all right.
Not an imperial
Well,
settlement.
let me. What were the settings that, when you were growing up, that you would hear these Yiddish song participatory sessions in?
Well, it's not so much what I heard. I mean, when I interviewed Fagel, she learned her songs because women would sit around. It's sort of like work bees, sit around mending clothing, making clothing, and those were opportunities to just sing and share songs. Taking a walk on the Sabbath was another time. Those were the occasions, especially when the girls were together. And it's interesting, I think it might have been Fagel who said they learned happy songs from the other girls and very sad songs from the older women. Of frustrations, of unrequited love, of their role as women and what marriage meant and what marriage was like and living through their children and I was a recipient of that. My parents would always say, for the Kinder. It's like my dad was a presser, my stepmother was a finisher, which means she sewed the finishing things on garments, which is felling on the inside, putting in shoulder pads, the lining of stuff. And she worked in a room with about 4 other women, and Sarah didn't sing, but these other women sang. So, you work 7-8 hours and you're just sewing and sewing, going blind, sticking yourself, and you sing. That was a major occasion. The occasion, yeah, so it was so important to do everything you could to improve the opportunity for the next generation. And that, is probably still true today. And maybe in all cultures, but it was extremely true with all of the families that I knew and my own family. Alles für die Kinder. So, but the occasions were really the social occasions, you know, family circles, getting together. And of course, the occasions differ once you're in this setting rather than in Europe. But Fagel would always talk about learning songs from the neighbors and from her aunts and from her mother and from other seamstresses, and she did a lot of sewing. And Michael can talk about the context for Bronya in terms of, you know, when all of her singing happened. The other thing that I found most interesting is that all of the women I've ever spoken to, they amassed their repertoire before their 14th year. You know, it's like, that's when you got all the songs, you know, and then I guess sometimes you sang them more than other people or less. But it's amazing that the repertoire was in place, you know, by 14, 15.
Or, yeah, I mean, or 18.
Or 18,
right,
yeah.
that's-
That's sort of an amazing thing to know as you think about how to revitalize this tradition.
Yeah,
You know, what,
and that's who, yeah.
what demographic you need
and
to
we talk
work on.
about how to reach younger people.
Yeah.
Yay, Jake.
Yeah.
Totally an example of that.
Yeah, yeah, and creating new contexts, which we can get into also in terms
Yeah.
of Klezcamp and KlezKanada and, you know.
I want to turn to Michael. I mean, Michael, you talk often about your family being a bit sort of an anachronistic family, given the sort of unique demographic that you were born into. Do you want to talk about that and how Yiddish was a part of your life? And
Yeah,
the
just, I
charts.
mean, as a kind of, you know, sort of counterpoint to what Ethel was saying, that my family, especially in particular my father's family, were not urban Jews, they were rural. And so, which was not the world of the, you know, of the needle trades, you know, not the world of tailors and
Furriers,
shoemakers,
hat
and also, right, other
makers.
members of a
Yeah.
sort of more urbanized proletariat. But they were rural Jews, loggers, came out of this, you know, I grew up very strongly with a sense of the natural world, very much as a part of Yiddishkeit, of East European Jewishness, and that was my father and the rest of my family on my father's side came from Lithuania and northwestern Belarus. And
can I say, what year was your father born?
1906, and he was the youngest of you know, of all my aunts and uncles. So, thus, my immediate relatives, aunts and uncles on my father's side, go back into the 19th century. Pretty much all of them except my father. And right, I mean, they came from Lithuania, this you know world of forests. First and foremost, forests, lakes, you know, chains of lakes connected, a lot like, you know, Minnesota or Finland, Sweden. I mean, the whole kind of northern parts of the Russian and East European world, and so wood was really central to, and wood in literally and in a kind of consciousness of things, wooden, fish were a big part of it. You know, so the things that I learned at my father's knee and my family's knees were fishing, chopping wood, cutting down trees. I mean, knowing how to fell trees, just, and again with this consciousness of like that the natural world was so important. I mean, I realized when I went. I started going to Eastern Europe when I was 16. At that time, to Yugoslavia, 'cause like Ethel, I also took a big foray via the music of the Balkans, in particular Yugoslavia. But when I went to first time that I really went to Poland, especially northern Poland. I realized, you know, this is what they were talking about. It was all about, it was about lakes in the woods and forests and fields, and the Yiddish expression veldil and veldil, and the fields and forests, and that's exactly what the environment was like. I mean, you've heard me probably tell before. I mean, that, you know, one of my cousins said about one of my favorite uncles that he would much later in life, I mean, really in the 80s, he said it, said that my Uncle Yosky would rather use the cheapest piece of pine over the most expensive piece of plastic. And that really kind of summed up
Says it all.
the ethos of my family. And there was this really, you know, it's kind of, it's a world that doesn't exist much anymore, of, you know, I mean, a very traditional kind of Yiddishkeit. I mean, both religiously or spiritually traditional, and also traditional in terms of lifestyle, in terms of I mean, ethnically, culturally traditional, in terms of language, cuisine, and which meant not only Yiddish, it meant also, in our case, Russian and Polish and other local languages. And that was very much was part and parcel of, I mean, Jewishness was about, for me, the experience of the natural world was very connected with that, and music was in there too, and singing. I mean, exactly this older generation of people who, in our lives, were the immigrant generation, particularly from pre-World War I, Eastern
Yeah.
Europe,
Yeah.
that just right. And you mentioned anachronistic. I mean, we've had this conversation a lot, but that I mean, Ethel and I each, I think, were, you know, I'll speak for myself. I mean, I feel like I had the privilege and unusual experience of being born into this, you know, like a time capsule in some ways. Not that it wasn't connected absolutely with the contemporary world of the U.S. in our case, but it's, you know, almost like a slice of the late Russian Empire and Jewish life on the western borderlands of that.
And you grew up both in Massachusetts as well as California, and I mean, you talked about sort of this boardwalk culture of California,
Right,
which maybe it'd be interesting to hear a little bit. I mean, was your family part of that boardwalk culture? Maybe describe that. And
They weren't so much active you know, I mean, they weren't makers of it, but we partook of it. And what I mean by like boardwalk culture, or boardwalk music in particular, I think I've used, was the phenomenon of older, I mean, when I came along, older East European Jews, the East European Jews of the immigrant generation here in America, getting together in not only in homes and in more, you know, inside gatherings, but on boardwalks like the boardwalk in Venice Beach in L.A. Because I mean, I spent teenage years in New England, but I really come from California. Getting together to play music and sing, play mandolins, guitars, especially old the Russian 7-string guitars, accordions, sometimes violins, and sing.
And octophones, maybe sometimes.
Yeah, I never heard of an octophone until I was 20. But
there's a folkways connection.
Folkways reference.
octophone.
Exactly, right. Prince, right? Nathan Prince
Nazarov,
Nazarov, right? And right, Jewish Freilich music on both 10-inch folkways, but
Right.
That kind of stuff. A bunch of twangy instruments and some wheezy instruments, but you know, but beautiful singing and in Yiddish, in Russian, and you know, especially in my world.
So it sounds like for both Ethel and Michael, you had such a rootedness in Yiddish culture, and you know, this Yiddish song tradition was there. And then as you started to develop as into professional performers, you know, which in both your cases happened pretty early on, you know, you more levitated toward Balkan music, and then came back to.
I'm not sure we levitated.
Levitated. I'm not sure.
You can say it's
Drifted.
Drifted.
It's
That's a
levitation.
Levitation.
In terms of, you know, sort of levels of.
So it seems like there's sort of
Spiritual
a parallel in both of your early careers, and I'm kind of curious about that.
That's interesting.
And sort of more widely, what the involvement in Jews and sort of well, you know, a lot of talk about involvement in Jews in the folk music revival, but also specifically this you know, interest in Balkan music and how that carried you further into more Yiddish
Yeah, I
music.
mean, I think for me, it was women's voices in harmony that kind of drew me, you know. So, although Pyatnitsky Choir, which started in 1911, interestingly enough, with factory workers, with Pyatnitsky conducting,
And that was where?
men and women. That was in Russia.
Mhm.
In the Soviet Union.
In the Soviet Union, yes. Well, 1911 it wasn't.
Oh,
the
right,
Soviet Union.
right.
So, and I grew up with those recordings, you know, and I spent a lot of time at the Stanley Theater, which showed Soviet films by the time I was going. And that's a Folkways record, the Pyatnitsky Choir. But it was just compelling, you know, these women's voices, not in pop style or operatic style or jazz style, but in a traditional style, which is really a very different kind of sound. And these voices in harmony and the way they latched on to each other and the expressivity and the intimacy was so beautiful. And that's where I went.
So there was an aesthetic incentive for you to
Yeah,
kind of that
and
direction.
as well as, you
Mhm.
know, a familiarity. I mean, obviously I
Mhm.
didn't know Bulgarian, but, you know, I grew up with a lot of Russian folk music,
Mhm.
you know, and the East European Yiddish, you know, came together. It was all one community.
Mhm.
East European Jews that I
Mhm.
grew up with.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, that should be stressed, that, I mean, as, you know, we tend to focus these days on, you know, and for good reason, I mean, on Yiddish, and, you know, well, I'll get up on my soapbox here a little bit in terms of contemporary Yiddishism. To me is again, understandably, I mean, but it like a lot of cultural revitalization movements or phenomena in the world today, they tend to get more and more insular. I mean, it's almost it's a kind of nationalism, and leave out, you know, very much focused on, you know, inwardly towards only Yiddish or only Hungarian, or and that tends to, you know, ignore all too much the, you know, incredible interaction of cultures
Right.
in general. I mean, everywhere in the world.
Yeah.
But, that as East European Jews, we come out of a milieu that, you know, it's often depicted as insular and rather than as part of a whole intercultural network. And so, I mean, Russian music especially was, for those of us that were from the Russian Empire, also, you know, for, say, Austro-Hungarian Jews, I mean, Hungarian music was, you know, often big, and or, you know, Viennese, German sort of music was maybe a counterpart, but Russian music was really, really, it was like our music. It was one of the
Absolutely.
dialects of our music.
Absolutely.
Also.
That's a good segue to what Jake has been doing, you know, in this talk about
Yes.
sort of bringing back the multicultural connections of Yiddish music.
Right.
And I mean, Jake, you're of a different generation
Completely.
than,
Yeah.
I mean, even basically me, so I'm artistic generation. I mean, could you talk about, how did you get into this old music, and
Well,
what have you been doing recently with it?
I guess I sort of, in one way, I'm a very typical American Jew of my generation, and in another way, not so typical. The way that I am typical is that all my grandparents were born in Brooklyn, speaking Yiddish, to immigrant parents. So my great-grandparents were immigrants, I think, except for one of them who was also born in New York, but mostly from Ukraine and Belarus. And so my grandparents, if pressed, can speak some Yiddish, but forgot it, basically. They, you know, their first language was Yiddish, but they don't really speak it anymore. It was sort of the typical story of assimilation into American mainstream culture, growing up in the Depression, having to poor parents in general, except for actually one part of my family had an ironworks business that they brought over from Kiev, so they were wealthy.
Oh, my grandfather was in the iron business.
Oh, yeah.
We have to talk
Well,
about.
there
Oh,
we go.
wow.
But
and a lot of blacksmiths too.
Yeah, right.
In the family, so right.
Yeah, it was
But
son of a Swede.
The idea was, you speak English, you get a stable job as soon as you can. My grandfather was an accountant his whole life. This kind of thing. And so my parents basically speak no Yiddish. They didn't really grow up around this. It wasn't regarded as something to pay attention to in particular, although it was there. I mean, my mother specifically talks about not really being able to converse with her grandmother because she only spoke Yiddish. But when I was really little, I think my parents, who sort of became hippies and moved to Vermont and kind of did that thing, all of a sudden they had a Jewish son, and they were thinking, how do we, they sort of had left behind their Jewish identity a little bit, I think, which Zionism played a big role in that. For lefty Jews, they were sort of disgusted and alienated with that that part of it, and they were trying to figure out it's still important to give our kids a Jewish education. What do we do? So a lot of their friends were involved in the workmen's circle, Shula, the Upper West Side Shula, which is a secular organization and a secular cultural Yiddishist education, and so that was a way to send me there, was a way of getting a Jewish education that was not Zionist, that was not religious. So they did that. So me and my sister both went there from the time we were 4, singing Yiddish songs, totally workman's circle thing, and I guess it just caught on to me. I don't know. Just I started playing violin, and I started playing klezmer music when I was young. I mean, I was 12. I'd been singing these songs since I was 4, but I really started playing it on the violin when I was 12, and I never stopped, and it became very important to me. But yeah, in terms of the multicultural connection, I noticed this at a pretty young age. I think I was in high school. I started listening to Romanian Gypsy music, Greek music, Turkish music, and really hearing a lot of similarity to what I knew of as Jewish music, the Klezmer music, Yiddish music, all this. And I think I was really attracted to that connection, just sort of innately, because I thought it was interesting, and I love all of the different styles equally, and I love to see how they interacted, and the shared repertoire. I love the idea of, well, it's not just an idea, but I love the fact that Yiddish is sort of, Yiddish culture and Yiddish music is sort of a culture without boundaries that moves between all of these different cultures that are based on a land, and it's sort of living testament to the fact that culture moves in a way that passports can't. So
transnational.
Yeah, transnational
Yeah.
culture, and so I went to Hungary to study when I was in college. I went, got a Fulbright in Romania to study Moldavian music, and I've been to Romania tons of times to, research, do field research and with old musicians, but also just study from younger musicians. Most of those players are Gypsy. There's not much in the way of Jewish music left in Romania, you know. But if you dig a little bit, there's actually a ton. So just through the kind of musical traditions that have been carried on there. No one will, you know, people probably won't know it, you know, that it had anything to do with Jewish culture.
Right.
This trill or this kind of, this tune or this sort of style of playing.
Do you find that mostly true? Because I mean, I was going to say the whole role of Roma in performing and ultimately in many, you know, often being the transmitters or the people who've carried on Jewish music. But do you find that most people are not aware, or that?
I've found
I've had kind of the opposite experience.
Really? Well, I've found in Romania that if they're old enough to have remembered playing for Jewish weddings, then of course they know exactly what this was for, and you know, and if when they were growing up professionally there were no Jewish weddings to be played, they didn't need that knowledge. So, but sometimes they still have the tunes, and maybe they know, oh, this was a Jewish tune that my father taught me. Or sometimes they just know it as, this is a Romanian dance that we play at weddings, and Dave Terrace recorded it also, you know, or you know, that kind of thing. So, so yeah, this is a really important element of even my identity as a Jew and a citizen of the world, and as a musician.
Great.
Now it's time for you to talk, Pete. How did you get connected to all of this?
Oh, well, I guess growing up, I sort of in a way came from a product of a mixed marriage as well. My mother came from a more assimilated Jewish family. My mother's grandparents had come from different parts of mainly Ukraine. On my father's side, it was my grandparents who had come from around Brisk-Litovsk. So this is now on the Brisk is, I guess in Russian, Brest, and Polish Brezh. It's a city on the Bug River, which is the border between Poland and Belarus, White Russia. So, but for my mother's family, I got music. I got, you know, because my grandmother was a concert pianist when she was young.
Wow.
I never saw her play because I guess she had gotten out of practice and was so disgusted in her lack of what she used to be that she would never play anymore. But you know, you could put on any piece of music, and you know, within the first 3 bars, Grandma Alma could tell you who the pianist was, who, you know, what movement it was, you know, whether it was Beethoven's Sonata Number 7 in this key, and I mean, it was just an incredible mind for music. And my grandfather was also a wonderful appreciator of music, so that was a really special thing for them. And my mother grew up in Broadway show, you know, doing Broadway shows and things like that. Was very active in community theater in Rochester, New York, where we grew up. But on my father's side was where I got a lot of Yiddish. I mean, a lot more sort of immersion in Yiddishkeit. They were, you know, from Eastern Europe, and you know, the dialogue around the dinner table was always half in Yiddish, whatever they didn't want you to understand, and the rest in English. But from an early age, for some reason, you know, we'd have, you know, simchas, you know, family celebrations, and I always found myself, I was the one there was a lot of cousins. I was always the one who wanted to sit with the old folks, you know, and listen to the old stories. And for me, it was just this, you know, this incredible, I mean, Michael used the word time capsule experience, you know, where you could sort of transport yourself through these stories and songs to a different world. And for whatever reason, it always just, from an early age, my earliest memories is I always wanted to just learn as much as I could, you know, hear those stories over and over. There was only a limited amount of stories, and I had
Learn them well.
a lot of time. So I heard the stories a lot, but it was like that. And, you know, growing up, I, you know, grew up in Rochester, New York, and went to synagogue with my father every week. We had a very good cantor named Sam Rosenbaum, who was actually one of Mark Slobin's main informants on his whole study of the American cantorate. And, I, you know, gained a so I always had, you know, throughout my musical growing up, you know, my friends and I were into, folk, American folk music, Big Bill Brunsey, Lightnin' Hopkins, I was a real sort of a blues guitar addict when I was a teenager. And just locked myself in the room for hours upon end trying to pick guitar like Mississippi John Hurt, which I still can, right, Michael?
Absolutely.
Right. Humor me.
Right.
So, but I, for years I just never knew how to sort of explore, as a performer, explore Jewish music really. And as my musical interest developed from sort of blues, I got interested in upstate New York has a very interesting hammered dulcimer and fiddle tradition. Still wonderful old-time hammered dulcimer player Paul Van Arsdale is up in Tonawanda, New York, still going, now in his 90s. And I guess somehow I gravitated in this interest between these sounds of a violin and a struck instrument. Maybe it was from first banjo and fiddle recordings. I got really interested in that, but I just didn't know that world of really existed in klezmer. I mean, I knew what klezmer was sort of very superficially, but I wasn't here. What I always heard was these jazzy sort of bands and things like that just had no aesthetic interest to me, and it wasn't. I think it was. I mean, the first things that I heard that really sparked a lot of interest was Andy Statman's music, particularly on mandolin, and his album with Zev Feldman. I picked up in college. I think my senior year of college, I was in Ithaca, New York, and I picked up a copy of the Dave Terrace music for a Jewish wedding that Ethel and Marty had put out with Zev and Andy. And then I started realizing there's something much more folky than what I've been sort of led to believe about klezmer. And actually, another turning point was in the mid-'90s was the Itzhak Perlman's involvement in klezmer. Michael was the music director of a documentary called In the Fiddler's House, which really lifted klezmer to a much higher level of public visibility in the United States. And the opening scene, is Deborah Strauss, this wonderful, fantastic klezmer violinist playing in a courtyard in Krakow.
Actually, I thought it was Kurt Bierling playing in a courtyard in Krakow as well. That's how it starts. But
oh, okay. I just remember the scene of Deborah playing this beautiful doina, and I'm like, wow, there's fiddle, there's real Jewish fiddle music,
right, exactly.
Which I hadn't really heard before until then, and so that project really gave me a sort of a whole. It sort of between those different listening experiences, I was sort of able to put together musical worlds together that I didn't realize could be put together. I knew there must have been some space where that existed, but I never found the way to find that until those that series of listening experiences.
That was sorry, go on. You're talking about.
No, that was
I wanted
that was
to
the story.
sleep in. Yeah, I mean, especially for we all have various experiences of. I don't know if this. I bet it speaks to you in the same way too, but certainly the three of us have this important experience of American traditional music or of other kinds of traditional musics that, because of both the presence, I would say, both the presence and the absence of awareness of our own, of parts of our own traditional musics, especially the instrumental tradition, when we were growing up, that all these other musics spoke to us in that way. And I often kind of say that Balkan music was almost like a kind of proxy for, especially the music of the South Balkans, like a proxy for Jewish music, until such time as we were able to find our ways to it via, in particular, 78 recordings, but also, which is not to say, one of my routes to it was, music that was played at Jewish weddings, which, still, in the 60s especially was, there was more Jewish music, a lot more, and, but mainly clarinet-based music. But then also hearing both from people that had old 78 recordings. My uncle was one of my uncles was one of those people, and also hearing what was on the Yiddish radio, where, like in Boston, I mean, Ben Galing would play. He'd put on these old 78s, and I remember, kind of, and as a kid in LA, hearing that stuff on the radio, the old, band 78s of the kind of transitional European into American era Jewish music, and hearing these, these Jewish orchestras playing that with this all these incredible interweaving parts, and what we refer to, as heterophony these days, all kinds of, and I'm feeling like this is really this is deep old Jewish music. It's like that was part of the experience too. But yeah, that kind of stuff, both the recordings and then older musicians, instrumental musicians, giving us this window into and a way to reclaim, maybe claim for the first time, or reclaim this, a whole tradition that, more and more pieces of it that I think that our endeavors have been about.
Yeah, I think people find this kind of stuff by sort of where it touches where you are,
right?
And then you're there, and then there's all of this under, I also, I grew up really into rock,
Right.
my parents were playing, Bob Dylan and Paul Simon, all the time, but also Led Zeppelin and, getting into all that kind of stuff. And I think that's why I gravitated towards Alicia Spiegels, who was my first violin teacher, because she's also totally came from Led Zeppelin and inspired by that, and her playing also is really, so it's kind of rock klezmer violin, her style, and that's actually what really got me hooked on it.
Right.
In the first, when I was really young, and then after that, it was I sort of copied her, and then the rest was okay. Find everything else and soak that in too.
That's what I've always felt that. I also had certainly this came out of rock and roll and the sort of the folk into rock and roll continuum, and that really what I feel a lot of the people that that I've worked with over the years, or to me the best music that what I've been going for in Yiddish music is playing or whatever traditional musics they are, Yiddish and peripheral musics and or whatever all the musics that I or we make. It was making that music with the energy and with the the downness of rock and roll, with the drive of rock and roll. So that's a very important thing.
One thread that's sort of coming through, it was your original question, Pete. What was the context for this music? And the context has so dramatically shifted, but new contexts have been provided, such as, the camps for the various musics, across the board, and performance. That's a very major way in to the music, and a context for the music, and it's so different. It's not so different. Weddings were performance, but the wedding music that happened then is really not happening.
That was
now.
functional performance,
totally,
as opposed
totally.
to
Right, but
yeah, right.
but still doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting. The contexts are different. Where are we on time?
A few more minutes.
Oh.
10
few minutes. Okay. Why don't we? Should we talk about a little bit about everybody, our experience? Just to say it, the An-sky Yiddish Heritage Ensemble. This is the first time we've performed together, and now each of us, we've all had the experience of playing in different, performing in different combinations.
Say it.
Yeah.
What you said,
With each
say what
other.
you said before
What did I say?
about the 4 decades.
Oh yeah, we're over 4 decades between us. Yeah, and Michael and I have been singing and performing and teaching together, and you and Jake have been doing that. So it's wonderful that we have that range of expression in our group.
So what about the ensemble, hopefully it won't be while we're going to be performing all week at the Folklife Festival.
Yeah.
But I don't know, what to you is sort of interesting about this ensemble, or what do you
Well, for
hope
me,
we capture
I've
in
never
performance?
performed with instruments.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm an a cappella singer, either in performance or by myself or with groups of people or in whatever settings I find myself.
It should be said that Ethel, I don't think we mentioned it, was the leader of the Penny Whistlers in the 60s, which was one of the major sort of, really had a sort of an interesting niche, I should say, in the folk revival.
Right. Well, that was the outlet for all this wonderful women's voices in harmony. To have the Penny Whistlers, which actually, I mean, we were a group of friends. No one auditioned. And it always has other issues around, whatever. But we were friends and remained friends, and that was really nice. So certainly singing with instruments is different, and integrating unaccompanied singing in this context is also very interesting, and it's a challenge. I mean, we've been working about, where should we put this, how will that work, and how can we get a flow going, and some frame for what we're doing. So it's exciting.
I think I've had a lot of experiences. You were talking about these camps, and one of the things I've had to do sometimes at teaching at these Klezmer camps, teaching students how to play Klezmer music or Yiddish music, is accompany. I mean, especially at Weimar, actually, we with Sasha Luria, she was sort of giving students songs that she had learned a lot from you, actually, these unaccompanied things. And our project was to have, I had an instrumental ensemble, and these students would come in, and I'd have to get my instrumentalists to accompany these normally a cappella songs instrumentally, and it forces the instrumentalists to really, really know what the words are, and feel the song in a completely different way than a song that's sort of like a kind of song.
Yeah.
It's really, really a different way of playing music, which is great.
Right. And it's a challenge in terms of what you were talking about, Pete, how to pass on. I mean, I think the fact that there's so much creativity happening is really coming out of a very deep grounding in the tradition. So somehow that has to continue, that deep grounding, for it to really continue, and new songs, new instrumental pieces. So it comes out of that. Andy talks a lot about that. Andy Statman, yeah. He had an experience teaching. We lost our. Well, let's stay with what we're talking about here. But just quickly, I mean, Andy doesn't particularly teach, and the experience that he had is, everyone's going off and making new music, and it's like it's just floating around. There are no roots there. There's nothing that's grounding it. There's a real sense of continuity and depth, and it loses its depth. So that's our challenge. And, before we did this interview, I was thinking, gosh, An-sky Jewish Heritage Ensemble. There should be many An-sky Jewish Heritage Ensembles. Really, I mean, it's like another mechanism for doing this and integrating it.
Right.
What about you,
It's
Michael?
a franchise. Let's see, what about me?
And the ensemble.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I guess I'm the person that kind of does a number of these traditions, and I mean, that's kind of a role I've been in much of my life. Is that I do knowing the language, and I sing the old the old style unaccompanied
Right.
songs and all that, and I'm a musician, instrumentalist, and, and in that position of, sometimes I'm a singer that plays instruments, and sometimes I'm a musician that sings, that kind of thing. And I mean, they're not such disparate. I mean, they're not disparate at all, although they're distinctive idioms. But yeah, I was going to say, I mean, well, on the one hand, it's not as if everyone is just kind of floundering around without roots, because I mean, there's at this point, there's people like Jake and your generation, without although I still have this naive idea of like we're all kind of one generation or different points on a spectrum of experience.
No, Andy, I just have to clarify. Andy was talking about fusing different musics
right.
and just taking off,
Right,
and there
right.
is no grounding. I was
Right.
not at all referring to anyone who has been involved.
Well,
in
not
this
only
music.
us involved here, but I mean, there's so much, really informed, amazing
Mm.
creativity in the
Yeah.
Jewish music, the Yiddish music world now too.
Absolutely.
But that certainly was not always true. And the opposite is also simultaneously true, that there are people that, really don't, I think that there are people who don't have much grounding. I mean, it's true from the beginning. I was used to say that, like, it's one of the only traditional music revival phenomena where the majority of people have not, and I would include myself in this as far as instrumental music from the beginning, kind of started taking it somewhere without actually knowing the traditional music cold before taking it somewhere. And I mean, and there are issues with the language too. I mean, it's
Yes.
like, I would often talk about, I have often referred to the fact that, I mean, can you imagine things like Latin music or salsa, where almost no one involved in it. I mean, you could practically count the people on one hand who speak Spanish.
Yeah.
It's like,
Well, it also this issue also comes from klezmer music or Yiddish music becoming a genre,
right.
which is problematic. I mean, because now you have like jazz musicians saying, "Oh, I'm a jazz musician, but I'm gonna use some klezmer," and like as if they were using elements of rock or
Right.
like klezmer music being a genre is
Right.
problematic to the depth and breadth of the music.
Right.
It's also very Jewish. I mean, it's extremely Jewish. And I mean, the historical pattern of Jews in most places is to, I mean, we adapt and acculturate, to whatever our current environment is. That it's, the Jewish aesthetic is not necessarily to have an attachment to a particular cultural style and
Right.
kind of cling to that. That's not the center of our identity.
No.
And yet it's very, at the same time, I mean, it is both, it both is and isn't, and I think that contradiction or that balance, is an extremely Jewish thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard when it's sort of a fragile thing when the lines between what it is and isn't are
Right.
vague. I mean,
Right.
it's like, people hear Romanian music and they think, oh, that sounds so Jewish. But why does it sound Jewish? Because Jews used it. So to, American ears, it came to them through the context of Jewish music, but it's not particularly Jewish.
Right.
So
or
those
it is and
kinds
it's
of,
gone
or
into Romanian music,
yeah,
and
or
vice
who
versa,
knows? I mean,
right.
it's so that kind of gray area thing complicates it.
Right.
Yeah. And I mean, just so to me, I mean, there's such an exciting opportunity for this ensemble to, I think, expose people to alternative aesthetic traditions. That, I mean, I think the Yiddish songs that we present are not the Yiddish songs you normally hear at concerts of Yiddish music. This is, most of the stuff we're performing is I guess you would say, is pretty rare repertoire that maybe was embedded in a particular geography in Europe or in particular communities in the New World. and things like that. And really, it wasn't part of the sort of the top 20 hits of Yiddish that you hear recorded over and over again. So I think not only, so the exciting thing is to put that together as well as present it in its something much closer for stage, but much closer to its traditional soundscape in terms of the singing style. It's a different style of singing than, so I guess you would say a bel canto performance style that you see so often. And so you have this very intimate Yiddish song tradition put together with this other very intimate fiddle cimbalom tradition. Michael does some batchonis, which is the traditional wedding gesture. He's only one of the few people in the world who can do this performance art anymore.
I don't know if it in the world. I mean, because there's all these
in the Hasidic community, it survives.
Yeah,
But
very much alive.
Yeah, for sure,
A living
for sure.
form.
So I think the opportunity to present these things, these different parts, really wonderfully, incredibly beautiful aspects of the Yiddish performing arts tradition that are really, you just don't hear at all. And in a way, we're sort of packaging them together for a concert audience, and we'll see what happens with that. It's exciting.
Yeah.
So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.